Most of what we're taught about history starts with a clear beginning, a first civilization, a moment where everything changes. But when archaeologists study the ground itself, that clarity starts to fade. Dates overlap. Settlements are rebuilt on top of older ones. Monumental structures appear earlier than expected, then vanish without explanation. The physical record doesn't tell a clean story. It preserves pieces, stone foundations, broken tools, buried layers spread across thousands of years. When those pieces are examined carefully, they don't point to a single starting point. They suggest repetition, construction, abandonment, reuse, growth, followed by reorganization. In this documentary, we're not following legends or speculation. We're looking only at what has been measured, dated, and excavated. Layer by layer, site by site, this video examines what the archaeological record actually shows and what it quietly refuses to confirm. The record does not begin where we thought it did. The modern historical record opens with written language, formal calendars, and recognizable political states. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets from Uruk, dated to around 3100 BCE, record transactions, names, and inventories. In Egypt, royal inscriptions appear shortly after, already standardized in form. These beginnings are usually treated as the start of civilization. Earlier periods are described as prehistoric, a term that places them outside the main sequence of recorded human activity. This division rests on documentation, rather than population, labor, or permanence. Archaeology has gradually complicated that boundary. In southeastern Turkey, the site known as Göbekli Tepe was first identified in 1963 during a surface survey conducted by Istanbul University and the University of Chicago. Excavation began in 1995 under Klaus Schmidt. Radiocarbon dating places the earliest layers at approximately 9,600 BCE. The site consists of large circular enclosures formed by T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing more than 10 tons, arranged with consistent orientation and carved with animal reliefs. Göbekli Tepe predates pottery, metal tools, and agriculture as traditionally defined. No domestic structures were found within the main enclosures. The pillars were cut, transported, and erected using stone tools. The scale of labor required suggests coordinated effort over extended periods. Schmidt noted that the site appeared to have been deliberately backfilled, layer by layer, after centuries of use. No written explanation accompanies the act. Similar complexities appear elsewhere. At Jericho, excavations led by Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s revealed a stone tower and defensive wall dating to roughly 8,000 BCE. The tower stands over 8 meters high and was constructed before the widespread adoption of farming in the region. Its purpose remains undetermined. The settlement shows evidence of long-term occupation, planning, and maintenance, yet it exists outside the standard model of early city formation. In the Americas, sites such as Monte Verde in southern Chile challenged long-standing assumptions. Excavated by Tom Dillahay beginning in the late 1970s, Monte Verde yielded organic remains dated to around 14,500 years ago. Wooden structures, plant materials, and preserved footprints were documented. These dates precede the Clovis culture, which for decades had been considered the earliest human presence in the Americas. Acceptance of Monte Verde required revisions to migration timelines rather than the addition of new explanatory frameworks. Geological records introduce further interruptions. The Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt cooling beginning around 10,900 BCE, is well documented in ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica. Temperature shifts occurred within decades. Glacial advance returned to regions previously warming. Lake levels changed rapidly, and vegetation zones shifted. Human populations existing during this interval experienced environmental pressure that left uneven archaeological traces. In some regions, occupation layers thin or vanish entirely for centuries. Ice core samples from the Greenland Ice Sheet Project and the Antarctic EPICA program preserve atmospheric data extending back hundreds of thousands of years. These cores show repeated cycles of warming and cooling, each associated with changes in sea level. During periods of lower sea level, land bridges and coastal plains were exposed. modern shorelines do not match those of earlier periods. Any settlements built near ancient coasts would now lie submerged, beyond the reach of most archaeological surveys. Underwater archaeology has begun to document this loss. In the Gulf of Cambay, off the western coast of India, sonar surveys conducted in 2001 identified geometric anomalies at depths of approximately 36 meters. Stone objects were retrieved by dredging. Some were tentatively dated to the early Holocene, though the site remains contested due to stratigraphic disturbance. Similar submerged landscapes have been mapped in the North Sea, where Doggerland once connected Britain to continental Europe before being flooded around 6000 BCE. Material continuity is not always preserved. In Mesopotamia, the Ubaid period shows gradual development in architecture and craft. Earlier levels, however, display abrupt shifts in settlement pattern. At Tel Brak and Eridu, layers of occupation are separated by deposits of wind-blown sediment. The reasons for abandonment are not specified by the material record. In Egypt, the transition from the Badarian to Naqada cultures involves changes in burial practices and tool styles without clear demographic markers. Ancient texts sometimes reference earlier epochs without context. The Sumerian king list, preserved on multiple tablets dated to the early 2nd millennium BCE, begins with rulers who reigned for thousands of years before a great flood. After the flood, reign lengths shorten and kingship moves between cities. The list does not explain the mechanism behind these shifts. It records them as administrative facts. Similar compressions of time appear in Egyptian king lists, where entire periods are omitted or grouped. Archaeological classification depends on surviving evidence. Stone endures longer than wood or fiber. Writing preserves only what is inscribed. Catastrophic events, whether climatic or geological, can erase material traces unevenly. Volcanic eruptions such as the one at Thera around 1600 BCE are known to have buried settlements under meters of ash, preserving some while obliterating others. Flooding, erosion, and tectonic movement operate without regard to human record-keeping. By the early 20th century, scholars such as V. Gordon Childe described civilization as a sequence of revolutions, each defined by specific technologies. This framework relies on linear progression. Subsequent discoveries have added depth but not altered the structure. Layers are extended downward, gaps are noted, and timelines are adjusted. The foundational assumption remains that the sequence begins once, advances forward, and does not reset. The evidence itself remains neutral. Structures appear, disappear, and reappear in different forms. Dates cluster and separate. Some techniques emerge without visible precursors. Others vanish despite apparent utility. The record that survives is partial by necessity. It begins where preservation allows and ends where disturbance intervenes. What lies between those points is described only where material remains are present to support description. Dates without context accumulate in the soil. Archaeological time is assembled from fragments rather than narratives. The ground does not preserve intention, memory, or explanation. It preserves material under specific conditions. When excavation begins, the first task is not interpretation, but separation. Layers are identified by texture, color, compaction, and inclusion. Each layer represents a span of deposition. Some form slowly through wind and sediment, others appear abruptly through collapse, flooding, or abandonment. The order of layers provides sequence, not meaning. Radiocarbon dating estimates age by measuring the decay of carbon-14 in organic remains. The method was introduced by Willard Libby in 1949 and refined over decades. Living organisms absorb carbon from the atmosphere. After death, radioactive decay begins. Measurement yields an estimate of elapsed time. Because atmospheric carbon levels have varied, raw results are calibrated using reference datasets derived from tree rings, corals, and ice cores. These ranges are often misunderstood as points. A sample dated to 7000 BCE represents a probability distribution. The material may belong anywhere within that window. Multiple samples reduce uncertainty but do not eliminate it. At sites with repeated occupation, overlapping ranges accumulate. The result is a cluster of dates without internal explanation. Archaeologists note presence and duration. They do not infer continuity unless stratigraphy supports it. Stratigraphy orders deposits by position. Lower layers are older than those above them when undisturbed. This principle, articulated in the 17th century by Nicholas Steno, underlies excavation practice. Each cut, fill, or construction event interrupts earlier deposits. Careful recording tracks these interruptions. A floor built over refuse marks a change in use. A collapsed layer signals abandonment or disaster. Stratigraphy provides relative order. Absolute dates anchor only selected points. At Çatalhöyük, located on the Konya Plain in central Anatolia, excavation has revealed a dense vertical sequence. The settlement was occupied between approximately 7,400 and 6,200 BCE. Houses were built directly adjacent to one another without streets. Entry occurred through roof openings. Over time, structures were abandoned, filled, and rebuilt on the same footprints. Plaster was applied repeatedly to interior walls. Burials were placed beneath floors. The site contains 18 major building levels. Radiocarbon samples from Çatalhöyük derive from hearths, burials, and construction fills. They do not explain why the settlement formed in that location, or why its architectural form remained consistent for centuries, nor do they clarify why occupation ceased. The accumulation of dates outlines persistence without motive. Calibration has altered many chronologies. Early radiocarbon results underestimated age due to uncorrected atmospheric variation. As calibration curves improved, timelines expanded. Events once thought compressed were revealed as extended processes. The Neolithic transition in the Levant illustrates this shift. Early interpretations placed the emergence of farming around 8000 BCE. Calibrated dates now show cultivation beginning earlier in some areas and persisting alongside foraging for centuries. In the southern Levant, sites such as Jerf el Ahmar and Abu Huraira preserve pre-pottery Neolithic levels. Circular and rectilinear structures appear before widespread domestication. Grinding stones and storage pits suggest planned subsistence. Radiocarbon dates cluster between 10,000 and 9,000 BCE. These dates precede ceramic technology. They also precede formal metallurgy. The sequence shows organization without the markers traditionally used to define civilization. Thermoluminescence dating extends chronology to ceramics. When clay is fired, trapped electrons are reset. Over time, radiation causes electrons to accumulate again. Heating the sample releases stored energy as light. Measurement estimates time since last firing. Optically stimulated luminescence operates on similar principles, but measures last exposure to sunlight. These methods date sediments and construction materials where organic remains are absent. Luminescence dates often carry large error margins. They are interpreted within stratigraphic frameworks. At sites with disturbed layers, confidence decreases. In desert environments, wind can redeposit sediments, mixing ages. Luminescence provides boundaries rather than precision. Its contribution is cumulative rather than definitive. In the Indus Valley, chronological frameworks rely on stratigraphy and artifact typology. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro show standardized baked brick architecture dated to the 3rd millennium BCE. Beneath these levels lie earlier phases with different construction techniques. The Indus River shifted course repeatedly. Radiocarbon dates bracket rebuilding episodes. The record shows recurrence without commentary. No contemporary written records describe the origins of Indus urbanism. The script remains undeciphered. Seal inscriptions provide names and symbols without narrative context. Chronology establishes sequence. It does not supply explanation. The cities appear fully formed in the archaeological record, persist for centuries, then decline. Dates mark boundaries. Causes remain inferred indirectly. Dendrochronology offers annual resolution where wood survives. Tree rings record growth variations tied to climate. By matching overlapping sequences, continuous chronologies are built. In the American Southwest, dendrochronology has dated pueblo and structures to specific years. Beams used in construction preserve cutting dates. These dates reveal building pulses and periods of repair. Correlation with climatic data shows drought intervals aligning with abandonment phases. At Mesa Verde, major construction ceased in the late 13th century. Tree ring data indicate prolonged drought. The record supports environmental stress as a factor. Even so, dendrochronology dates actions, not decisions. The presence of a drought does not explain social response. Ice cores extend chronological context beyond human settlement. Annual snowfall layers trap atmospheric gases and particulates. Volcanic eruptions leave sulfate spikes. Dust levels reflect aridity. Oxygen isotope ratios indicate temperature. These records provide independent timelines. Archaeological events can be aligned with climatic shifts. The eruption of Thera, also known as Santorini, appears in ice core sulfate layers. Its date has been debated for decades. Radiocarbon samples from buried olive branches suggest a mid-16th century BCE date. Archaeological correlations in Egypt and the Aegean support slightly later estimates. The discrepancy remains unresolved. The event exists as a chronological marker with uncertain placement. In East Asia, Neolithic sequences rely on pottery styles and stratigraphy. The Yangshao culture, dated to roughly 5000 to 3000 BCE, precedes the Longshan culture. Longshan sites show walled settlements and social differentiation. Radiocarbon dates indicate overlap between cultures. In some regions, Longshan features appear before Yangshao traits disappear. The sequence resists linear classification. Burn layers at some Longshan sites suggest conflict or catastrophe. Others show gradual transformation. Dates cluster around transitions without identifying mechanisms. Written records begin centuries later during the Shang dynasty. The gap between material change and textual explanation remains. In Australia, radiocarbon and luminescence dating place human presence beyond 50,000 years ago. Sites such as Majid Baby in the Northern Territory preserve stone tools and ochre dated to approximately 65,000 years. Occupation persists through climatic extremes. During periods of aridity, site density decreases. The record thins but does not vanish. Chronological gaps often reflect preservation bias rather than absence. Coastal sites from early periods are submerged due to sea level rise following the last glacial maximum. Shorelines moved inland as ice melted. Any settlements built near ancient coasts now lie underwater. Survey coverage is limited. Dates from inland sites provide partial coverage. Underwater archaeology has begun mapping submerged landscapes. In the North Sea, sonar surveys have identified river channels and plains known collectively as Doggerland. Radiocarbon dates from dredged peat indicate human activity before inundation around 6000 BCE. Stone tools recovered by fishing nets attest to occupation. The chronology outlines loss without detail. Context depends on association. A radiocarbon date reflects the age of the sampled material, not necessarily the feature in which it is found. Old wood reused in construction yields earlier dates than building events. Charcoal can be residual. Burrowing animals move material vertically. Roots penetrate layers. Flooding redistributes sediments. Excavators document disturbances, but interpretation remains cautious. Chronological tables present sequences as ordered lists. Period names imply coherence and progression. In practice, boundaries blur. The transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age varies regionally. Iron appears sporadically alongside bronze. Adoption is uneven. Dates overlap. Labels simplify communication. The underlying data remain complex. In Egypt, radiocarbon dating has refined dynastic timelines. Samples from monuments at Giza, Saqqara, and Dashur have been analyzed to compare material dates with historical chronology. Results generally align within a few centuries. Pre-dynastic periods remain less precisely dated. Cemetery sequences are ordered by grave goods and stratigraphy. Absolute dates cluster without narrative. The Sumerian king list provides another example of chronology without context. The list records rulers and reign lengths, some extending thousands of years before a flood. After the flood, reigns shortened dramatically. The document does not explain the change. It records sequence as administrative fact. The list remains a chronological artifact without explanatory framework. In Mesoamerica, the emergence of Olmec centers such as San Lorenzo and La Venta occurs around 1400 BCE. Monumental stone heads appear abruptly in the archaeological record. Radiocarbon dates bracket construction phases. Earlier occupation exists but lacks monumental expression. The sequence documents appearance without precedent explanation. Dating methods also reveal synchronization across regions. Similar climatic events affect distant populations simultaneously. The 8.2 kiloyear event, a brief cooling period around 6,200 BCE, appears in ice cores and lake sediments worldwide. Archaeological sites in the Near East show settlement disruption during this interval. Dates align across continents. Interpretation remains general. Chronology forms a scaffold. It supports relative placement of sites and artifacts. It does not generate narrative. Where texts exist, dates anchor events. Where texts are absent, dates stand alone. They indicate presence, duration, and sequence. Interpretation relies on pattern recognition rather than direct testimony. Archaeology records what can be measured. Time is measured through decay, accumulation, and exposure. Context is reconstructed from association. The soil preserves unevenly. Some centuries leave dense traces, others leave little. The resulting chronology is precise within defined limits and silent beyond them. Dates accumulate. Context remains incomplete. Structures appear before the tools that define them. Archaeological classification often assumes that construction follows technology. Stone architecture is expected after quarrying methods are refined. Large buildings are expected after surplus production is established. Monumental planning is usually placed after the development of complex administration. In practice, the material record does not always follow this order. At several sites, large structures appear in layers that lack the tools normally associated with their construction. At Göbekli Tepe, limestone pillars were shaped with stone implements before the use of pottery or metal. The pillars are consistent in size and form. Many stand over 5 meters tall. Relief carvings depict animals native to the region during the early Holocene. No domestic buildings accompany the earliest enclosures. Storage facilities are minimal. The site shows repeated construction and maintenance over centuries. The tools recovered are simple flint blades and scrapers. Stone working at this scale requires planning and coordination. Quarry marks indicate extraction points nearby. Transport paths have been identified along bedrock ridges. The labor implied exceeds what is typically attributed to mobile foraging groups, yet the associated material culture remains limited. There is no evidence of wheeled transport, draft animals, or advanced cutting tools. The structures exist without the technological framework later considered necessary. In the Jordan Valley, the pre-pottery Neolithic site of Jericho presents a similar pattern. The stone tower and surrounding wall date to roughly 8000 BCE. The tower contains an internal staircase and reaches over 8 meters in height. Construction required sustained labor and knowledge of stone stacking. At the time, ceramics were not yet in use. Metal tools were absent. Subsistence relied on early cultivation and foraging. The function of the Jericho Tower remains uncertain. No definitive defensive features have been identified. The wall does not fully enclose the settlement. Some interpretations suggest flood control or ritual significance. The material record does not resolve purpose, it documents existence. The tower stands as a structural fact without explanatory tools. In Malta, a series of megalithic temples were constructed between 3600 and 2500 BCE. Sites such as Chezgantija, Ajar Kiyim, and Mnujdra consist of large limestone blocks arranged in complex plans. Some stones weigh over 20 tons. The builders use stone tools. Metal appears late and sparsely in the sequence. No clear evidence of wheeled vehicles has been found from the temple phase. The Maltese temples predate Stonehenge. They also predate widespread bronze use on the islands. The architecture shows standardized layouts and precise orientation. Walls curve smoothly. Doorways align with celestial events. Despite this complexity, associated artifacts are limited to stone tools, pottery, and figurines. The structures exist without a parallel expansion in visible technology. On the island of Sardinia, Nuraghi towers appear beginning around 1800 BCE. These dry stone structures rise several meters high and contain internal chambers and stairways. Thousands were built across the island. Early Nuraghe lack associated metal workshops or administrative centers. bronze objects appear later. The towers precede clear evidence of hierarchical governance. In Peru, monumental construction at Caral dates to approximately 2600 BCE. The site includes large platform mounds, sunken plazas, and residential areas. Construction involved moving large volumes of earth and stone. No ceramics have been recovered from the earliest phases. Metal was unknown. The economy relied on agriculture, supplemented by marine resources. Textiles and quipu-like cord systems appear, but writing does not. Carroll's architecture demonstrates planning and coordination over extended periods. Radiocarbon dates show continuous occupation for centuries. The absence of ceramics distinguishes it from later Andean societies. The structures exist without the material markers later used to define complexity in the region. In North America, Poverty Point in present-day Louisiana dates to around 1700 BCE. The site consists of massive earthworks arranged in concentric ridges and mounds. Construction required moving millions of cubic meters of soil. The builders used baskets and manual labor. Pottery is scarce in early phases. No evidence of permanent agriculture has been found. Artifacts at Poverty Point include stone tools made from materials sourced hundreds of kilometers away. The site shows long-distance exchange. Despite this, residential evidence is limited. The earthworks stand as the primary material expression. Their purpose remains debated. The structures precede the technological and social features later associated with mound-building cultures. In Britain, Stonehenge's earliest phase began around 3000 BCE. The initial earthwork enclosure predates the placement of large sarsen stones. Blue stones were transported from Wales over long distances. The builders used stone hammers and wooden levers. Metal tools were minimal or absent during early phases. The monument evolved over centuries, with changing configurations. Stonehenge exists within a broader ritual landscape including avenues, barrows, and timber circles. The structures appear before extensive evidence of social stratification. Burial goods are modest in early phases. The architecture precedes clear markers of centralized authority. At Nabta Playa in southern Egypt, stone circles and alignments date to the 5th millennium BCE. These features predate dynastic Egypt. They consist of upright stones arranged with apparent astronomical alignment. The builders were pastoralists. Pottery exists, but metal does not. The structures are simple yet intentional. In the Levant, early plastered skulls appear in Neolithic contexts. These ritual objects require preparation and repeated handling. They coexist with early architecture. The practice appears before writing or metallurgy. It reflects symbolic behavior embedded in domestic settings. Structures and rituals develop alongside each other without technological escalation. In East Asia, early rammed earth walls appear during the Longshan period. These fortifications require organized labor and planning. Stone and wooden tools were used. Bronze metallurgy was emerging but not yet dominant. The walls appear before standardized writing. They mark territorial boundaries without recorded administration. The pattern repeats across regions. Large-scale construction appears in contexts lacking the tools later assumed necessary. Architecture does not always follow technological accumulation. Instead, structures emerge when labor, planning, and shared purpose align. The material record captures the result, not the process. Archaeological interpretation often retrofits explanation. Tools are expected to precede structures. When they do not, emphasis shifts to social organization or ritual motivation. These interpretations rely on analogy rather than direct evidence. The structures themselves remain primary data. Dating establishes sequence. It shows that buildings exist earlier than expected. It does not explain how knowledge was transmitted or why construction occurred at specific times. The absence of tools is as significant as their presence. It defines the limits of inference. The archaeological record preserves stone more readily than wood or fiber. Some technologies may have existed without leaving durable traces. Others may not have existed at all. Structures endure. Tools decay. The imbalance shapes interpretation. What remains consistent is the order. In multiple regions, architecture appears before the technologies used to define later civilizations. The soil records this sequence without commentary. Structures stand in layers that lack expected precursors. The record notes their presence and moves on. Knowledge survives when materials do not. Archaeological evidence privileges what endures. Stone walls, fired clay, and bone persist in the soil. Wood, fiber, leather, and most organic compounds decay unless sealed by unusual conditions. As a result, the record emphasizes outcomes rather than methods. Structures remain visible long after the tools and techniques used to produce them have vanished. What survives is the finished form, not the process. Construction implies knowledge, even when tools are absent. At Göbekli Tepe, the T-shaped pillars were carved with consistent proportions. Their surfaces were smoothed. Reliefs were incised with controlled depth. These results indicate familiarity with stone behavior under impact and abrasion. The flint tools recovered are simple in form. The skill required to produce the pillars is not directly represented by the tools themselves. It is inferred from the precision of the stonework. Transport of large materials leaves minimal traces. At many sites, quarries are identified near construction areas, but intermediate stages are rarely preserved. Wooden sleds, rollers, ropes, and scaffolding decay. Soil compaction patterns may hint at movement paths, but these are subtle and often ambiguous. The absence of transport tools does not negate their use. It reflects preservation limits. In Malta, the temple builders shaped limestone blocks with curved surfaces and fitted them together with tight joints. The stone is relatively soft, but the consistency of curvature suggests controlled shaping techniques. No metal chisels from the earliest phases have been recovered. Stone hammers and abrasives account for some shaping, but the efficiency implied by the volume of work points to practiced methods. The knowledge is embedded in the architecture rather than in surviving implements. Similar patterns appear in ancient Egypt. Predynastic sites show increasing architectural complexity before the widespread use of copper tools. Mud brick construction required standardized brick sizes, controlled drying, and coordinated labor. Brick molds made of wood would not survive. The bricks themselves remain. The system that produced them must be reconstructed indirectly. Measurement systems are rarely preserved, yet alignment and proportion imply their existence. At Stonehenge, distances between features and angles of placement are consistent. The Sarsen circle maintains near-uniform spacing. This suggests counting, pacing, or chord-based measurement. Chords and markers decay. The geometry remains. In the Andean region, Carroll's platform mounds were built in stages. Fill materials were organized within woven bags, known as shikra. These bags were made of plant fiber. In some cases, mineralized impressions remain. Most have decayed. The use of standardized containers implies logistical planning. The bags themselves were tools. Their absence would obscure the method without the rare preservation of impressions. Knowledge transmission does not require writing. Skills can be passed through observation and repetition. In societies without durable records, instruction leaves no direct trace. The archaeological record captures the result of accumulated learning without documenting its transfer. When continuity exists over centuries, as at Çatalhöyük, the consistency of building techniques implies stable knowledge systems. The record shows repetition without explanation. Experimental archaeology attempts to bridge this gap. Researchers replicate ancient techniques using available materials. These experiments demonstrate feasibility but do not prove historical practice. They illustrate that complex results can be achieved with simple tools when skill is present. The experiments underline a limitation of the record. Absence of evidence for a tool does not equal evidence of absence of capability. In the Pacific, the construction of Moai statues on Rapa Nui involved quarrying, shaping, and transport of large stone figures. Early European observers recorded local oral traditions describing methods. Archaeological evidence includes incomplete statues and tool marks. Wooden elements such as sleds and ropes are absent. The statues themselves preserve the outcome. Knowledge of movement and balance is inferred from their placement. Astronomical alignments provide another example. At Nabta Playa, stone arrangements correspond to solstitial positions. The stones are small and unworked. The knowledge required to place them meaningfully lies in observation rather than material complexity. No instruments survive. The sky itself served as reference. The alignment is the record. In Mesoamerica, early ceremonial centers such as La Venta show axial planning. Platforms align along consistent orientations. This planning predates writing in the region. Survey tools made of wood or fiber would not survive. The orientation persists. Knowledge of direction and space is evident without material residue. Textile production illustrates loss of evidence. Spinning, weaving, and knotting techniques require tools such as spindles, looms, and frames. In some environments, spindle whorls survive. Looms rarely do. Yet textile impressions on ceramics and mineralized fibers in burials attest to complex weaving traditions. The finished cloth often decays entirely. The knowledge is visible only indirectly. Navigation skills leave minimal traces. Coastal and riverine travel likely relied on boats made of wood, reed, or hide. Few early watercraft survive. Yet the distribution of materials and species across islands indicates movement. In the Mediterranean, obsidian sourcing shows seafaring as early as the Mesolithic. The tools used to build and operate boats are largely absent. The exchange networks remain. Mathematical understanding is inferred from pattern. Repetition, symmetry, and ratio appear in architecture and art. At sites across Eurasia, megalithic structures exhibit consistent spacing and orientation. Whether this reflects formal mathematics or practical experience is not determinable from the material alone. The record shows application without notation. Loss of materials also affects interpretation of social organization. Authority structures, teaching roles, and planning bodies do not fossilize. A coordinated construction effort implies leadership or shared norms. The form that organization took is not preserved, only the result indicates its existence. Fire management is another area where knowledge exceeds material trace. Hearths and burned layers indicate use of fire. The techniques for ignition, control, and fuel selection are not preserved. Ethnographic analogy fills gaps, but direct evidence remains limited. The persistence of fire use over millennia implies stable transmission of practice. In some cases, exceptional preservation reveals contrast. At sites sealed by volcanic ash, such as Akrotiri on Thera, wooden furniture and tools are preserved as voids. These rare instances show how much is normally lost. The everyday objects documented there likely existed elsewhere but decayed. The absence of similar finds at other sites reflects conditions, not absence of practice. Archaeological interpretation must account for this imbalance. What survives shapes narratives. Stone and fired clay dominate. Organic technologies recede. The knowledge required to integrate these elements is reconstructed from outcomes. This reconstruction is cautious by necessity. The record shows that skill and planning often exceed the visible toolkits. Knowledge persists through practice and tradition, even when materials fail to endure. The soil records result selectively, techniques disappear, structures remain. The imbalance is structural, not anomalous. Sequences reset without erasing what came before. Archaeological sequences rarely progress in a continuous line. Layers accumulate, pause, and resume. In many regions, occupation deposits are interrupted by sterile strata of sand, ash, or silt. These interruptions do not always coincide with total abandonment. They mark changes in use, population density, or environmental conditions. When occupation resumes, it often does so with altered material forms while retaining underlying practices. In the Near East, the transition between the pre-pottery Neolithic B and later ceramic Neolithic phases shows such a reset. At sites like Ain Ghazal in present-day Jordan, large-scale settlements flourished between roughly 7,400 and 6,000 BCE. The site contained plastered floors, multi-room houses, and ritual objects such as lime-plastered statues. After several centuries, occupation thinned. Parts of the settlement were abandoned. When activity resumed, architecture was simpler. Ceramics appeared. The earlier monumental ritual forms did not return, yet domestic planning principles persisted. Environmental data suggest that this shift coincided with climatic instability. Pollen records indicate increasing aridity. Soil erosion increased. The archaeological layers show wind-blown sediment between phases. The reset is visible as a material break. It is not accompanied by evidence of population replacement. Tool traditions evolve gradually rather than abruptly. knowledge appears redistributed rather than lost. In Mesopotamia, long occupation sequences reveal repeated resets. At Tel Brak in northern Syria, settlement expanded rapidly during the 4th millennium BCE, forming one of the earliest urban centers. Large public buildings, dense residential quarters, and administrative artifacts appear in the archaeological record. Around 3200 BCE, parts of the site were abandoned. Thick layers of dust accumulated. Later occupation resumed on a reduced scale. Urban density did not immediately return, but ceramic styles and subsistence practices show continuity. Flood deposits mark other resets. In the Indus Valley, cities such as Mohenjo-Daro were rebuilt multiple times following inundation. Each rebuilding episode raised street levels. Drainage systems were repaired or modified. Brick dimensions remained standardized across phases. The continuity of measurement suggests retained technical knowledge despite disruption. Written records do not describe these events. The resets are inferred from stratigraphy alone. Volcanic activity produces clear stratigraphic markers. At Çatalhöyük, ash layers from distant eruptions appear intermittently within occupation deposits. These layers did not end settlement but altered daily activity. Construction continued above them. At Akrotiri on Thera, a much larger eruption around the mid-2nd millennium BCE buried the settlement entirely. When the site was later reoccupied, building styles differed. The earlier town plan was not restored. Knowledge of construction remained regional but not site-specific. In East Asia, the transition from the late Neolithic to the early Bronze Age includes similar patterns. At Erlitou, in the Yellow River Basin, early palatial architecture appears around 1900 BCE. Earlier, Longshan settlements in the region show walled compounds and rammed earth foundations. Between these phases, some sites were abandoned, others were reorganized. Ceramic traditions shifted gradually. The reset is visible in spatial organization rather than in tool loss. Mesoamerican sequences show repeated rebuilding over earlier ceremonial centers. At San Lorenzo, Olmec monuments were deliberately broken and buried around 900 BCE. Later construction did not restore the original layout. New centers emerged elsewhere, such as La Venta. Stone carving techniques persisted. Iconographic elements were reused. The reset altered location and emphasis without erasing tradition. In the Andes, Corral's decline around 1800 BCE was followed by reduced monumental construction along the Supe Valley. Later sites showed different architectural forms. Subsistence strategies persisted. Cotton cultivation and fishing continued. The reset affected scale and layout rather than basic economic practice. No written account records the change. The material sequence marks it. In Europe, Neolithic longhouses appear and disappear across centuries. In Central Europe, linear banceramic settlements expanded rapidly around 5500 BCE. After several centuries, many regions show reduced site density. Longhouse construction ceases. Later cultures adopt different building forms. Stone tool traditions evolve gradually. Agricultural practices continue. The reset affects architecture and settlement pattern, not subsistence. Glacial and post-glacial dynamics contribute to resets. As ice sheets retreated, new land became available. As sea levels rose, other land was lost. Coastal populations relocated inland. Archaeological sequences record these movements as breaks. The underlying knowledge of fishing, toolmaking, and navigation persists where evidence survives. In North America, Paleo-Indian sequences show resets linked to climatic events. The end of the Younger Dryas around 9700 BCE coincides with changes in projectile point styles. Clovis points disappear, Folsom points appear. The shift reflects adaptation rather than disappearance. Hunting strategies adjust. The record shows continuity through transformation. Resets are not uniform. Some involve rapid abandonment. Others unfold over generations. Material culture responds unevenly. High investment structures are often the first to be abandoned. Portable tools persist. Skills tied to daily survival endure more reliably than those tied to monumentality. The archaeological record distinguishes between loss and absence with difficulty. When a structure type disappears, it may reflect choice rather than incapacity. When a tool type vanishes, it may reflect changing needs rather than forgotten knowledge. Resets compress visible history. They create gaps that appear larger than they are. Radiocarbon dating brackets these resets but does not resolve their internal dynamics. A gap of 2 centuries may represent gradual change or sudden disruption. The soil records endpoints, not experience. Intermediate stages are often erased by erosion or later activity. In some cases, resets preserve earlier layers through burial. At Troy, successive cities were built atop one another. Destruction layers separate phases. Each city reused the mound. Knowledge of location persisted. Construction styles changed. The sequence documents renewal without erasure. The pattern repeats globally. Occupation sequences pause and resume. Material traditions shift. Core practices endure selectively. The record does not support a single uninterrupted progression. It shows repetition, adjustment, and return in altered form. Resets do not remove all traces of what came before. They reorganize what is expressed materially. The archaeological sequence records these reorganizations as stratified fact. It does not label them as collapse or progress. It preserves the order of change without assigning cause. What remains visible is sequence. Layers end, new layers begin. Between them lies an interval marked by sediment rather than artifacts. When occupation resumes, it draws on surviving knowledge in modified ways. The soil records this pattern repeatedly, across regions and periods. Accounts survive that do not align with the layers. Written records preserve information differently than soil. Texts compress time, omit intervals, and prioritize continuity over material detail. They often describe sequences of rulers, events, or eras without reference to physical remains. When compared with archaeological layers, these accounts do not always align. The discrepancy does not imply error in either record. It reflects differences in purpose, medium, and preservation. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerian king list is among the earliest historical documents. Copies of the list were found at sites such as Nippur, Lhasa, and Sippar, with versions dated to the early 2nd millennium BCE. The text records a sequence of kingship beginning before a flood. Early rulers are assigned reigns lasting tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reign lengths decrease sharply, and kingship moves between known cities. The list does not explain the transition. It presents the sequence as administrative fact. Archaeological layers in southern Mesopotamia do not preserve material evidence for rulers with reigns of such length. Early urban development at Uruk, Eridu, and Ur appears gradual and clustered within the 4th millennium BCE. The text extends chronology far beyond what material evidence supports. Yet the list was copied repeatedly, suggesting it held cultural or political significance independent of physical correlation. Egyptian king lists show similar compression. The Palermo stone and later records such as Manetho's Egyptiaca outline dynasties stretching back to divine or semi-divine rulers. Manetho, writing in the 3rd century BCE, described dynasties of gods and demigods preceding human kings. Archaeology does not corroborate these early reigns materially. Pre-dynastic cemeteries show gradual development rather than abrupt divine succession. The textual tradition preserves a conceptual past that does not map directly onto excavated layers. In China, early historical texts such as the Bamboo Annals describe rulers predating the Xia dynasty. These accounts include flood narratives and long reigns. Archaeological evidence for the Xia period remains debated. Sites such as Erlitou provide material corresponding to early Bronze Age complexity, but direct textual linkage is uncertain. The written chronology extends beyond secure archaeological attribution. Mesoamerican traditions preserve deep time through oral transmission recorded after European contact. The Popol Vuh of the Quechua Maya recounts multiple creations and destructions of humanity before the current era. These cycles are narrative rather than material. Archaeological sequences in the Maya region show settlement continuity and transformation, not discrete global resets. The text preserves cosmological order rather than stratigraphic sequence. In South Asia, the Puranas describe vast cycles of time divided into yugas. These cycles span hundreds of thousands of years. Genealogies of kings extend far beyond archaeological horizons. Material evidence for early urbanism in the Indus Valley begins around the 3rd millennium BCE. The textual chronology operates on a scale that archaeology does not address. Oral traditions among indigenous Australian groups recount ancestral events tied to landscape features. Some narratives describe sea level rise and coastal flooding. Geological data indicate that sea levels stabilized around 6,000 years ago. In some cases, oral accounts correspond broadly to these events. The narratives do not preserve dates. They encode change in relational terms. Archaeological layers record occupation shifts without narrative context. The two records intersect loosely. The Hebrew Bible contains genealogies and chronologies extending back to early patriarchs. These texts were compiled over centuries. Archaeological evidence for early Iron Age settlement in the Levant aligns partially with later portions of the narrative. Earlier accounts remain without clear material correlation. The text preserves lineage and covenant rather than settlement stratigraphy. Greek historians such as Herodotus and Hesiod wrote of earlier ages populated by heroes and demigods. Hesiod's sequence of ages moves from gold to iron. Archaeological layers do not reflect moral decline. They show technological and social change. The texts provide moral structure rather than empirical chronology. In some cases, texts omit periods visible archaeologically. Egyptian records show gaps where intermediate periods are minimized or ignored. Archaeology documents decentralization during these intervals. The textual silence reflects political perspective. The layers record continued occupation and adaptation. Conversely, texts may preserve events without material trace. Accounts of migrations, droughts, or conflicts may leave little archaeological signature if populations moved without constructing durable architecture. The absence of layers does not negate textual reference. It limits correlation. Chronological systems differ fundamentally. Archaeology measures time through accumulation and decay. Texts measure time through succession and memory. Oral traditions emphasize continuity of identity. Written chronicles emphasize legitimacy. Neither system is designed to align with stratigraphy. Attempts to reconcile the two records often involve selective correlation. Synchronisms are proposed where dates overlap. Discrepancies are attributed to myth, exaggeration, or loss. These approaches prioritize coherence. The underlying divergence remains. The survival of texts is itself uneven. Writing requires materials that endure or copying traditions that persist. Clay tablets survive where papyrus does not. Oral traditions survive where social continuity remains. The archaeological record preserves what conditions allow. Each archive is partial. When accounts extend beyond layers, they occupy a different evidentiary space. They inform how societies understood their past, rather than how that past unfolded materially. Archaeology records physical sequence without narrative intent. Texts record narrative sequence without material constraint. The coexistence of these records complicates reconstruction. Neither can fully subsume the other. Where they align, chronology gains density. Where they diverge, interpretation pauses. The gap itself becomes data. The archaeological record does not confirm or deny textual deep time. It documents what is preserved. Textual records do not require material confirmation to persist. They encode frameworks of origin, legitimacy, and continuity. Together, the two archives form parallel chronologies. One is layered and fragmentary. The other is continuous and selective. Their misalignment reflects differences in preservation and purpose rather than simple contradiction. Numbers appear where measurement should not exist. Quantification leaves traces even when its instruments do not. Marks, proportions, repetition, and standardization appear in contexts that lack writing or formal accounting systems. These traces are not explanations, they are outcomes. Archaeology encounters numbers indirectly, embedded in objects and layouts rather than recorded as symbols. Some of the earliest numerical evidence comes from notched bones and stones. Objects such as the Ashango bone, discovered near Lake Edward in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and dated to around 20,000 years ago, bear sequences of incisions grouped in patterns. The marks are evenly spaced and organized into columns. No text accompanies them. Their function is not specified by the material record. The object preserves counting behavior without context. Similar tally marks appear across Upper Paleolithic Europe Antler fragments and bone tools from sites such as Abry-Blanchard in France show repeated incisions. The marks vary in number and grouping. They are often interpreted as lunar counts or tallies of events. The interpretations remain provisional. What is certain is repetition. Counting occurred before durable notation systems existed. Standardization provides another form of numerical expression. In Mesopotamia, clay tokens appear as early as 8000 BCE. These small objects come in consistent shapes and sizes. Denise Schmunt-Besserat documented their use as accounting devices for goods such as grain and livestock. The tokens predate writing by several millennia. They represent quantities physically rather than symbolically. When writing emerged, these tokens were enclosed in clay envelopes called bullae. Impressions of the tokens were pressed into the surface before sealing. Eventually, the impressions replaced the tokens themselves. Numerical notation emerged gradually from material practice. The archaeological sequence records this transition without commentary. Measurement is also embedded in architecture. At sites such as Teotihuacan in central Mexico, the city grid follows consistent unit lengths. The Avenue of the Dead aligns structures at regular intervals. These measurements imply a standard unit. No measuring rods survive. The unit is reconstructed from repetition. The system existed before known writing in the region. In ancient Egypt, cubit rods, made of stone or wood, appear in later periods. Earlier architecture, however, already shows proportional consistency. Pre-dynastic tombs exhibit standardized dimensions. The Great Pyramid's proportions reflect precise ratios. The earliest phases of this knowledge are not preserved materially. The results endure. The tools do not. In the Indus Valley, brick dimensions are standardized across vast areas. Bricks follow a consistent ratio of length, width, and height. This ratio persists over centuries. The uniformity suggests agreed measurement conventions. No measuring devices from early phases have been recovered. The bricks themselves carry the numerical system. Astronomical observation introduces another form of counting. At sites such as Stonehenge, the spacing of stones and the alignment of features correspond to solar and lunar cycles. Tracking these cycles requires counting days or events over long periods. No calendars survive from the earliest phases. The alignments remain. In the Near East, early calendars are inferred from architectural orientation. Temples align with solstices or equinoxes. The repetition of alignment across sites suggests shared temporal frameworks. The frameworks are not described in text. They are expressed spatially. Weights provide direct evidence of quantification. In Mesopotamia, stone weights appear during the late 4th millennium BCE. They come in standardized forms and masses. Some are shaped like animals or geometric solids. The masses correspond to fractional systems. The weights imply exchange and valuation. Writing appears later to record transactions. Measurement preceded record-keeping. In China, standardized bronze vessels from the Shang dynasty reflect consistent volume and weight. Earlier periods show less uniformity. The transition suggests increasing formalization. The early phases preserve partial standardization without textual explanation. The numerical system emerges gradually through material repetition. In Mesoamerica, the long count calendar represents a sophisticated numerical system. Its earliest inscriptions date to the late 1st millennium BCE. Earlier cultures, however, already track time through ritual cycles. Architectural alignments and ceremonial intervals imply counting. The material record preserves structure without notation. In South America, quipu systems consist of knotted cords used for record keeping. Most surviving examples date to the Inca period. Earlier, Andean cultures likely use similar systems made of organic fiber. Few survive. The practice is inferred from continuity. Numbers existed materially without writing. Counting also appears in domestic contexts. Storage pits, granaries, and repeated vessel sizes imply portioning. At Neolithic sites, jars are often produced in standardized volumes. The repetition suggests measurement for storage or exchange. The vessels outlast the practices that define their use. The archaeological record rarely preserves abstract symbols without durable media. Stone and fired clay retain shape. Wood and fiber decay. Numerical systems embedded in perishable materials vanish. What remains are patterns of consistency. Ethnographic analogy suggests that counting often begins as concrete association. Objects are matched one-to-one rather than represented abstractly. Archaeology supports this. Early numerical evidence is tactile. Tokens represent goods, knots represent quantities, marks represent events. Abstraction increases later. The appearance of numbers without writing challenges linear assumptions. Quantification does not require literacy. It requires repetition and comparison. These are observable in material remains. The soil records results without revealing cognitive frameworks. Standardization across distance implies shared conventions. In the Indus Valley, brick ratios persist across hundreds of kilometers. In Mesopotamia, weight systems spread between cities. The mechanisms of transmission are not preserved. The consistency is. Errors and deviations also appear. Not all bricks conform perfectly. Not all weights match ideal values. Variation exists within tolerance. This suggests practical measurement rather than theoretical precision. Numbers functioned within use, not abstraction. In some cases, numerical traces disappear and later reappear. Following the collapse of the Indus cities, standardized bricks vanish. Later cultures adopt different proportions. The earlier system is not carried forward. The knowledge may have persisted locally without material expression. The record is silent. Counting practices are adaptive. They respond to economic and social needs. When surplus is managed, measurement becomes visible. When subsistence shifts, it may recede. The archaeological sequence captures this fluctuation. Numbers appear where material organization demands them. They are not always formalized. They are embedded in practice. Archaeology detects them through pattern rather than symbol. The presence of quantification without writing does not imply hidden bureaucracy. It indicates that numerical thinking preceded durable notation. Measurement systems can exist entirely within material culture. The soil preserves the outcomes of counting without preserving the act. Units, ratios, and alignments remain. The reasoning behind them does not. What survives is sufficient to demonstrate that numerical organization emerged early and repeatedly. Materials travel farther than people are expected to. Archaeological sites often contain materials that do not originate locally. Stone types, shells, metals, and pigments appear far from their geological sources. These materials are identified through petrographic analysis, isotopic signatures, and mineral composition. The distances involved are measurable. The reasons for movement are not recorded. The material record documents transfer without describing method or intent. Obsidian provides one of the clearest examples. Its chemical composition varies by volcanic source, allowing precise sourcing. In Anatolia, obsidian from Cappadocia appears at sites hundreds of kilometers away as early as the 9th millennium BCE. At Çatalhöyük, multiple obsidian sources are represented, including regions separated by mountain ranges. The tools themselves are small and portable. Their distribution implies repeated movement over long distances. In the Levant, obsidian from central Anatolia reached sites such as Jericho and Ain Ghazal. Radiocarbon dates place this exchange within pre-pottery Neolithic contexts. No evidence of pack animals exists for this period. Transport likely occurred through human movement or down-the-line exchange. The material record shows arrival, not route. Marine shells appear far inland. At Upper Paleolithic sites in Central Europe, shells from Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts have been recovered. These shells were often perforated and worn, indicating use as ornaments. Their presence inland suggests movement across multiple ecological zones. In Africa, ostrich eggshell beads are found hundreds of kilometers from the savannas where ostriches live. At sites in southern and eastern Africa dated to the late Pleistocene, bead styles are consistent across wide areas. The material suggests social networks extending beyond immediate territories. The beads preserve connection without revealing structure. Copper artifacts appear sporadically before formal metallurgy. In the Near East, native copper objects date to the 9th and 8th millennia BCE. These items are small and rare. The copper sources are identifiable. Their appearance suggests awareness of distant materials before systematic extraction. In Europe, jadeite axes from the Italian Alps have been found in Neolithic contexts across France, Britain and Iberia. The stone is dense and difficult to work. Many were deposited in ritual contexts. The distances involved exceed 1,000 kilometers. The movement occurred without wheeled transport or written records. Amber from the Baltic Sea appears in Mycenaean graves in Greece during the 2nd millennium BCE. Chemical analysis confirms its northern origin. The amber traveled through multiple intermediary regions. The archaeological record documents its final deposition. The sequence of exchange remains unrecorded. In the Americas, obsidian from central Mexico appears at sites in the Maya lowlands. The distances exceed 500 kilometers. Early exchange predates the rise of centralized states. Later periods show more formalized trade, but the earlier material movement is already established. The record captures continuity rather than origin. Pigments also travel. Red ochre appears widely in Paleolithic contexts. Source analysis indicates movement from specific deposits. Ochre was used for coloring objects, bodies, and possibly structures. The pigment survives where organic binders do not. Its presence indicates selection and transport. Stone used for construction often originates locally due to weight. Exceptions exist. At Stonehenge, bluestones were transported from the Preseli Hills in Wales to Salisbury Plain, a distance of over 200 kilometers. The stones weigh several tons. The methods of transport are not preserved. The stones remain in place. In ancient Egypt, stone for monumental construction was quarried from specific locations along the Nile. Granite from Aswan appears at sites hundreds of kilometers downstream. Transport likely relied on river movement. Boats made of wood and rope are poorly preserved. The finished monuments record delivery without method. In the Andes, spondylus shells from warm Pacific waters appear in highland sites far inland. These shells held symbolic value. Their presence at altitude required movement across ecological zones. The shells survive, the journeys do not. Exchange networks leave uneven traces. High-value materials are more likely to be preserved and identified. Everyday goods such as food and textiles decay. The archaeological record emphasizes durable items. This biases interpretation toward prestige exchange, even where subsistence exchange likely occurred. Distance does not imply migration. Materials can move through multiple hands without long-distance travel by individuals. Down-the-line exchange reduces travel requirements. Each transfer shortens the distance moved by any one person. The final distribution obscures the chain. In some cases, isotopic analysis of human remains indicates limited mobility despite widespread material exchange. At Neolithic European sites, strontium isotope data show that many individuals were local to their burial region. The materials buried with them were not. Objects moved farther than people. Maritime movement extends exchange reach. Coastal and island sites show early seafaring. Obsidian from Melos appears in mainland Greece as early as the Mesolithic. The Aegean Sea separates source and destination. Boats made of organic materials rarely survive. The obsidian does. In Southeast Asia, nephrite jade traveled between Taiwan, the Philippines, and mainland regions during the Neolithic. Workshops and finished objects are found across islands. The exchange predates metallurgy and writing. The stone records connection without explanation. In Africa, gold appears in Egyptian contexts sourced from Nubia. Later records describe mining expeditions. Earlier phases show gold objects without textual reference. The material precedes the documentation. Exchange can contract and expand. Following the collapse of long-distance networks, materials become more localized. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Mediterranean trade decreased. Archaeological layers show reduced diversity of imported goods. The earlier connections are not erased. They cease to be expressed materially. Trade routes are inferred from repeated associations. When similar materials appear along corridors, archaeologists propose pathways. These proposals remain models. The record does not preserve signage or agreements. It preserves endpoints. Value systems influence movement. Some materials are exchanged for symbolic reasons rather than utility. Jade axes, amber beads, and shells often show minimal wear. Their preservation reflects deliberate deposition. The reasons are not stated. Transport knowledge must have existed. Routes, seasonal timing, and risk management are implied. The absence of transport tools reflects decay rather than absence. The capacity for movement is demonstrated by result. The archaeological record shows that materials traveled widely before the emergence of states or formal economies. Exchange networks existed within flexible social systems. The scale varied by region and period. Materials move independently of political boundaries. Before borders, exchange followed geography, seasonality, and social ties. The record preserves objects across landscapes later divided. What remains consistent is distance. Stone, shell, and metal appear far from origin. The effort required is implied by weight and terrain. The record does not comment on difficulty. It records arrival. The soil captures the endpoint of movement. It does not record negotiation, transport, or intention. The presence of distant materials expands the spatial dimension of early societies without specifying structure. Materials traveled farther than people are often expected to in early periods. The archaeological record establishes this pattern repeatedly. It leaves explanation open. The objects remain where they were placed, long after the paths that carried them disappeared. The same solutions emerge in places that never met. Archaeology documents repeated material outcomes across regions separated by distance, climate, and culture. Similar structures, tools, and spatial arrangements appear without evidence of direct contact. These parallels are identified through form, function, and sequence. They are recorded descriptively. The reasons for convergence are not preserved. Circular architecture appears early and widely. In the Levant, early Neolithic settlements such as Jerf el Ahmar and Muribet include circular communal buildings dated to the 10th millennium BCE. In northern China, circular pit houses appear during the Paleogan culture several millennia later. In North America, circular earth lodges emerge in plains contexts. The forms are similar in footprint and spatial logic. The materials differ. The record shows convergence, not transmission. Rectangular architecture follows a comparable pattern. Rectilinear houses appear independently in the Near East, Europe, and East Asia. At Çatalhöyük, rectangular rooms replaced earlier rounded forms over time. In Neolithic Europe, long houses follow elongated rectangular plans. In the Yellow River Basin, early villages adopt rectilinear layouts. No material link connects these regions at the time these forms emerge. The solutions appear aligned to interior division and expansion rather than cultural borrowing. Monumental construction also converges. Earthen mounds appear in multiple regions. In the Mississippi Valley, mound building begins around the 3rd millennium BCE. In Japan, Kofun burial mounds appear much later, beginning in the 3rd century CE. In Europe, Neolithic long barrows and henges involve large-scale earth movement. The methods differ. The outcome, raised earth structures for communal or ritual use, recurs. Stone circles appear across continents. In Britain and Ireland, stone circles date to the late Neolithic and Bronze Age. In the Sahara, stone alignments at Nabta Playa date to the 5th millennium BCE. In South Asia, megalithic stone arrangements appear during the Iron Age. The stones are placed upright, often aligned with celestial events. The builders are separated by time and geography. The material record shows similar spatial logic. Tool forms also converge. Projectile points with bifacial flaking appear independently in Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The Clovis point in North America shares flaking principles with earlier Old World technologies. The specific forms differ. The underlying solution to penetrating force remains consistent. The archaeological record does not require direct inheritance to document similarity. Grinding stones appear wherever plant processing becomes significant. Mortars and pestles are found in early contexts across the Near East, East Asia, and the Americas. The materials vary. The function remains stable. The appearance correlates with dietary change rather than cultural contact. Storage solutions repeat. Subterranean pits lined with clay or stone appear in Neolithic Europe, ancient China, and the Andean highlands. The pits regulate temperature and moisture. The technique addresses preservation needs. The record shows repetition without linkage. Water management converges as well. Early irrigation canals appear independently in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and northern China. The channels follow gravity and terrain. Their dimensions reflect flow control. No evidence indicates shared planning between these regions at initial emergence. The material response to water scarcity produces similar outcomes. Urban layouts show parallel features. Grid planning appears at Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley and at Teotihuacan in Mesoamerica. Both cities feature orthogonal streets and standardized block sizes. The dates differ by more than a millennium. Writing systems are unrelated. The similarity lies in spatial efficiency rather than shared origin. Defensive structures also converge. Walls and ditches surround early settlements in Europe, China, and the Near East. The forms include palisades, earthen ramparts, and stone walls. The triggers vary. The material solution to perimeter control remains consistent. Burial practices display parallel development. Megalithic tombs appear in Europe, Korea, and parts of India. Collective burial within stone chambers recurs. The ritual meaning is not uniform. The physical solution to collective interment aligns across regions. Ceramic technology develops independently in multiple areas. Pottery appears in East Asia earlier than in the Near East. In the Americas, pottery emerges in Amazonia and later elsewhere. Vessel shapes converge toward rounded bases and standardized rims. These forms optimize firing and handling. The convergence reflects material constraints rather than contact. Calendrical tracking produces similar material expressions. Stone alignments marking solstices appear in different regions. Agricultural cycles require seasonal awareness. The sky provides a shared reference. The structures record observation rather than transmission. Mathematical proportion appears in architecture globally. Ratios emerge in building dimensions at sites lacking contact. These ratios often reflect ergonomic or structural efficiency. The record shows consistent outcomes under similar constraints. The appearance of similar solutions does not imply uniform cognition. It reflects interaction between human bodies, materials, and environments. Stone fractures predictably. Earth compacts under pressure. Water flows downhill. These constants guide construction choices. Experimental archaeology supports this interpretation. When modern researchers replicate ancient tasks using locally available materials, similar solutions emerge. The replication does not confirm historical pathways, it demonstrates constraint-driven convergence. Cultural boundaries do not prevent similar outcomes. In some cases, similar forms appear while nearby regions adopt different solutions. This variation suggests choice within constraint. Convergence is not inevitable. It is recurrent. The archaeological record identifies convergence through comparison. It does not privilege one region as origin. It documents multiple emergences. These emergences are dated independently. Their alignment in form is observed after the fact. In some instances, convergence leads to later divergence. Rectangular houses evolve differently across regions. Some expand vertically. Others remain single-story. The initial solution branches. The record preserves both. Parallel development complicates diffusion models. When similar forms appear without clear contact, diffusion is not required. Independent emergence becomes the parsimonious explanation. Archaeology records the result without asserting cause. The material record does not rank solutions. It records their presence. Similarity is noted descriptively. Explanation is deferred. The soil preserves outcomes without commentary. The recurrence of similar solutions across unconnected regions demonstrates that human responses to material and environmental constraints often align. These alignments appear repeatedly across time. They are visible only through comparative analysis. The archaeological archive is cumulative. As more sites are documented, parallels increase. This does not reduce regional specificity. It situates local developments within broader patterns. What remains unresolved is whether these solutions reflect shared cognitive tendencies or repeated adaptation to similar problems. The record does not adjudicate. It preserves the evidence of convergence. The same solutions appear where no contact can be demonstrated. The layers do not indicate exchange, they indicate repetition. The pattern is global and recurrent. The soil records this without emphasis. Similar forms sit quietly in distant strata. Their coexistence across regions is an observational fact. Interpretation remains bounded by evidence. Entire landscapes vanish from the record. Archaeological absence is not neutral. What is missing often reflects destruction rather than non-existence. Landscapes change through processes that remove evidence unevenly. Erosion, submergence, volcanic burial, and tectonic movement alter the surface faster than excavation can recover it. The archaeological record is shaped as much by loss as by preservation. Sea level rise has erased large portions of early human habitation. During the last glacial maximum, global sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than today. Coastal plains extended far beyond modern shorelines. Rivers followed different courses. Estuaries and deltas were exposed land. As ice sheets melted between approximately 12,000 and 6,000 BCE, coastlines migrated inland. Settlements built along earlier shores were submerged. Doggerland in the North Sea illustrates this process. Geological surveys and dredged material indicate a vast lowland connecting Britain to continental Europe. Radiocarbon-dated peat and animal remains show human activity before inundation. Stone tools recovered by trawlers attest to occupation. Rising sea levels gradually flooded the area. Storm surges accelerated erosion. By 6000 BCE, most of the land was underwater. The archaeological record survives only in fragments. Similar submergence occurred in Southeast Asia. The Sunda Shelf connected present-day Indonesia, Malaysia, and mainland Asia during lower sea levels. Human populations moved across this landscape. As seas rose, islands formed. Coastal settlements were submerged. Archaeological evidence is sparse not because occupation was absent, but because preservation conditions changed. River dynamics also erase evidence. Floodplains accumulate sediment rapidly. Settlements built near rivers may be buried under meters of alluvium. In Mesopotamia, early sites lie beneath later deposits. Some are accessible only through deep coring. Others remain undiscovered. The absence of surface remains does not indicate absence of activity. In the Nile Valley, repeated flooding reshaped settlement patterns. Pre-dynastic sites along former river courses are buried beneath later deposits or destroyed by channel migration. Modern agriculture and urbanization further disturb these layers. Archaeology reconstructs only portions of the ancient landscape. Glacial activity removes evidence differently. Advancing ice sheets scrape surfaces clean. In northern Europe and North America, glaciation erased earlier Paleolithic sites. Human presence before the last glacial advance is inferred indirectly through tools found beyond glaciated zones. The absence within glaciated regions reflects removal rather than non-occupation. Volcanic eruptions create both destruction and preservation. Thick ash deposits bury landscapes rapidly. At Pompeii and Herculaneum, this burial preserved architecture and organic material. Elsewhere, repeated eruptions render areas uninhabitable for extended periods. In the Andes and parts of Southeast Asia, volcanic layers separate occupation phases. Earlier evidence may lie too deep or be chemically altered. Erosion acts continuously. Wind and water remove sediment and artifacts from exposed surfaces. In arid regions, deflation exposes some sites while erasing others. In humid environments, vegetation and soil movement obscure remains. Mountainous terrain accelerates erosion. Settlements built on slopes are particularly vulnerable. Tectonic activity displaces landscapes vertically and horizontally. Earthquakes fracture strata. Uplift exposes some sites while submergence hides others. Along the Pacific Rim, tectonic movement has altered coastlines repeatedly. Archaeological layers are tilted, broken, or submerged. Reconstruction becomes complex. Human activity contributes to loss. Later construction destroys earlier layers. Urban centers built atop ancient sites remove evidence through foundation work. Stone from earlier structures is reused. In Rome, medieval and modern building consumed classical remains. In the Near East, mud brick architecture erodes rapidly. When abandoned, later reuse reshapes the record. Agricultural practices disturb stratigraphy. Ploughing mixes layers. Irrigation alters soil chemistry. Over centuries, these processes blur chronological boundaries. Some regions show extensive occupation histories reduced to thin artifact scatters. Forests conceal sites differently. In tropical environments, organic decay is rapid. Heavy vegetation limits survey. Acidic soils dissolve bone. Stone tools remain. Architecture made of wood disappears. The archaeological signature is minimal despite long-term occupation. In Amazonia, earthworks and anthropogenic soils known as terra preta indicate intensive pre-Columbian land use. For decades, the region was considered sparsely inhabited due to lack of visible ruins. Recent surveys reveal extensive modification. Much remains unexcavated. The landscape itself was altered, then reclaimed by forest. Deserts preserve selectively. Arid conditions protect stone and bone. Organic materials survive only under exceptional circumstances. Wind erosion removes shallow deposits. Sites appear as deflated surfaces with artifacts out of context. Chronology becomes difficult to establish. Ice preserves uniquely. In polar and alpine regions, organic materials survive in frozen contexts. As glaciers retreat due to modern warming, artifacts emerge. These finds indicate past activity in areas previously inaccessible. Their emergence reflects loss of ice rather than new occupation. The uneven survival of landscapes biases interpretation. Regions with favorable preservation appear central to narratives. Regions where evidence vanished appear marginal. This bias reflects preservation, not historical significance. Mapping past landscapes requires reconstruction. Paleoenvironmental studies use sediment cores, pollen analysis, and geomorphology to infer former conditions. These methods indicate where occupation was possible. They do not reveal settlement details. The absence of artifacts remains unresolved. Underwater archaeology addresses some loss. Sonar, submersibles, and remote sensing identify submerged features. Progress is slow and expensive. Coverage is limited. Many submerged landscapes remain unexplored. The known record represents a fraction of what was lost. Chronological gaps often coincide with environmental transitions. These gaps may reflect destruction rather than abandonment. When evidence resumes, it may appear as reoccupation. In some cases, populations never left. Their material traces were removed. The archaeological record is a residual archive. It reflects what survived destructive processes. Entire regions can vanish from visibility. Their absence shapes historical models. Interpretation must account for this asymmetry. Presence indicates survival. Absence indicates uncertainty. The distinction matters when reconstructing early human history. Lost landscapes represent missing chapters rather than empty ones. The soil does not preserve evenly. What is gone cannot be measured directly. Its absence must be inferred cautiously. Archaeology proceeds by accumulation. As methods improve, some lost evidence reappears. Most remains inaccessible. The record remains incomplete by nature. Entire landscapes vanish without leaving durable traces. The archaeological archive reflects this loss. It records fragments rather than totality. Reconstructions proceed with acknowledged gaps. The pattern is global. Coastlines, river valleys, and plains have shifted repeatedly. Human occupation followed these changes. The material record captures only what escaped removal. What survives is not representative of all that existed. It is representative of what endured. The vanished landscapes remain part of human history without material presence. Time compresses when only fragments remain. Archaeological time does not unfold evenly. It appears compressed where preservation is sparse and expanded where material accumulates. Long intervals can be represented by a few scattered artifacts. Short periods may produce dense stratigraphy. This imbalance shapes how duration is perceived. What survives determines apparent tempo. In regions with continuous sedimentation, such as river deltas or tell sites, centuries can be distinguished layer by layer. At sites like Tel es Sultan near Jericho, repeated rebuilding created thick occupation mounds. Floors, walls, and refuse layers accumulated gradually. Radiocarbon dates cluster closely. Change appears incremental. Elsewhere, the same span may leave only a thin scatter of tools. Open-air sites illustrate compression clearly. In arid or temperate zones without deep deposition, occupation surfaces erode. Artifacts are dispersed by wind, water, and trampling. A stone tool discarded 10,000 years ago may lie beside one discarded 8,000 years ago. Stratigraphic separation is lost. Paleolithic archaeology frequently encounters this problem. Many sites consist of mixed assemblages lacking clear layering. Tool typology is used to infer relative age. The method relies on assumed sequences of form. Where types overlap or persist, chronological resolution decreases. Long periods appear uniform. Cave sites preserve differently. Protected from erosion, caves accumulate deposits slowly. Occupation episodes stack vertically. Hearths, ash, and bone create discrete layers. At sites such as Lascaux or Chauvet, artistic phases can be separated by millennia. The same period represented as a blur outdoors appears stratified indoors. This contrast affects narrative scale. Regions with caves appear to have detailed histories. Regions without them appear static. The difference reflects preservation rather than behavior. Human activity occurred in both. Only one left: layered traces. Time compression also results from selective survival of materials. Stone tools persist. Wooden tools decay. If a technological change involved organic materials, it may leave little trace. The stone component appears unchanged. Innovation is hidden. Continuity is overstated. In the Mesolithic of Europe, microlithic stone tools remain similar for thousands of years. Organic components such as hafts, bindings, and containers are absent. The apparent stability of stone forms masks variation in composite tools. Time appears compressed into a single technological phase. Settlement patterns contribute to compression. Mobile groups leave ephemeral traces. Campsites are reused seasonally. Each use leaves minimal debris. Over time, repeated visits overlap spatially. The resulting assemblage represents many episodes collapsed into one layer. Duration is difficult to estimate. In contrast, sedentary settlements accumulate refuse. Middens grow. Structures are repaired. These processes create temporal resolution. Sedentism expands visible time. Mobility compresses it. Environmental stability influences accumulation. In stable environments, surfaces persist longer. Artifacts remain exposed and are reworked. In dynamic environments, rapid deposition creates separation. Floodplains bury surfaces quickly. Each flood seals a moment. The same number of years produces more layers. Chronological frameworks adapt to this unevenness. Period labels span different durations in different regions. The Neolithic covers millennia in some areas and centuries in others. The label suggests equivalence where none exists. Time is normalized conceptually while remaining uneven materially. Radiocarbon dating mitigates compression, but does not eliminate it. Dates are attached to samples, not surfaces. A few dates may represent long spans. Without dense sampling, gaps remain invisible. A site dated at 7000 BCE and again at 5000 BCE may have been occupied continuously or intermittently. The record cannot always distinguish. Calibration further smooths variation. Probability ranges overlap. Distinct events merge statistically. The resulting chronology appears continuous, even where occupation was episodic. Compression persists at the analytical level. In historical periods, written records counteract compression. Texts provide sequence even where material is sparse. In prehistoric contexts, no such counterbalance exists. The material record alone shapes perception. Time compression affects interpretation of change. Rapid shifts may appear gradual if intermediate stages are missing. Gradual processes may appear abrupt if only endpoints survive. Both distortions occur. The transition to agriculture illustrates this effect. In some regions, early cultivation phases are poorly preserved. The archaeological record jumps from foraging to established farming. Intermediate experimentation is underrepresented. Time appears compressed into a sudden change. In other regions, such as the Levant, early cultivation is well documented. The same transition appears gradual. The difference reflects preservation and research intensity rather than fundamental divergence. Technological diffusion is similarly affected. The spread of pottery appears rapid in areas where early ceramics are scarce. Where early ceramics are preserved, diffusion appears slower. The material record controls perceived speed. Time compression also influences population estimates. Sparse sites suggest low density. Dense sites suggest growth. If sites are missing due to erosion or submergence, population appears lower than it was. Duration and density are conflated. This compression extends to cultural attribution. Long-lived traditions may be grouped into single cultures. Internal variation is lost. The culture appears homogeneous. In reality, practices may have changed repeatedly. Archaeologists attempt to counteract compression through modeling. Paleo-environmental data provide independent timelines. Sediment cores indicate continuous processes. These can suggest occupation even where artifacts are sparse. The inference remains indirect. Ethnographic analogy offers another approach. Mobile societies today leave minimal material traces. Their histories are rich despite sparse archaeology. This comparison cautions against equating material paucity with temporal brevity. Time compression is not uniform across the record. It varies by environment, behavior, and research focus. Some periods are overrepresented. Others are underrepresented. The resulting historical picture is uneven. Recognition of compression alters interpretation. Apparent gaps may represent loss, not absence. Apparent stasis may conceal change. Duration must be inferred cautiously. The archaeological record is a time-lapse assembled from fragments. Where frames are missing, motion appears jerky. Where frames accumulate, motion slows. The underlying reality remains unknown. Fragments dictate scale. They determine whether centuries appear long or short. The perception of time emerges from what survives. Time does not pass differently in different regions. It is recorded differently. Compression reflects preservation, not experience. Understanding this distortion is essential for interpretation. Without it, narratives assign meaning to absence. With it, absence remains unresolved. The soil preserves uneven slices of time. Between them lie intervals that collapse into silence. Archaeology reconstructs duration from these slices while acknowledging compression. Time compresses when only fragments remain. The record reflects this constraint consistently. Interpretation proceeds within these limits. Layers suggest cycles rather than a single beginning. Long archaeological sequences rarely point to a single origin. Instead, they show repetition. Construction follows abandonment. Organization follows dispersal. Material forms appear, disappear, and return in altered configurations. These patterns emerge only where stratigraphy is deep enough to record them. Where preservation is thin, cycles are compressed or invisible. Where layers accumulate, repetition becomes clear. Tell sites in the Near East provide some of the clearest examples. A tell forms through repeated building on the same location. Structures are constructed, used, abandoned, and collapse. New structures are built atop the remains. Over centuries, the mound grows. Each layer represents a phase. At sites such as Tel Es Sultan, Tel Brak, and Tel Leilan, occupation spans thousands of years. The layers do not show a single moment of origin, followed by continuous growth. They show repeated reorganization. At Tel Brak, early urban expansion occurred during the 4th millennium BCE. Large public buildings and dense housing appeared. Later layers show contraction. Peripheral areas were abandoned. Activity concentrated in smaller zones. Centuries later, expansion resumed. The material record alternates between complexity and reduction. The sequence suggests fluctuation rather than linear ascent. Eridu, one of the earliest known settlements in southern Mesopotamia, shows a similar pattern. Temples were rebuilt repeatedly on the same platform. Each new structure followed the outline of the previous one, while altering scale and layout. The earliest levels date to the 6th millennium BCE. Later phases show increased monumentality. The cycle is architectural rather than demographic. The location remains significant across transformations. In Egypt, temple precincts exhibit repeated rebuilding across millennia. At Karnak, successive dynasties added, dismantled, or reoriented structures. Earlier buildings were incorporated into later foundations. The site grew through accumulation rather than replacement. Political authority changed. The ritual landscape persisted. The archaeological record shows continuity through cycles of modification. The Nile Valley more broadly reflects cyclical occupation tied to river dynamics. Settlements shifted with flood patterns. Sites were abandoned and later reoccupied nearby. Cemeteries moved. Architectural forms changed while subsistence strategies remained stable. The sequence does not mark a single civilizational beginning. It records repeated adaptation within a long corridor of habitation. In the Indus Valley, urban centers rose and declined. Early phases show regional variation. The mature Harappan period exhibits standardization across cities. Later phases fragment. Large cities were abandoned. Smaller settlements continued. Brick proportions changed. Writing ceased. The sequence records integration followed by dispersal. Earlier practices did not vanish entirely. They reappeared in modified form. In the Andes, cycles are visible at sites such as Tiwanaku. Monumental construction expanded between the 5th and 10th centuries CE. After decline, the region did not become uninhabited. Smaller communities persisted. Agricultural terraces continued to be used. Later states drew on earlier infrastructure. The cycle affected scale rather than presence. Mesoamerican archaeology shows repeated ceremonial rebuilding. At Teotihuacan, major construction phases occurred over centuries. After decline around the 6th century CE, the city was not erased. It remained a pilgrimage site. Later cultures reused the space. The cycle involved transformation of function rather than disappearance. Earlier periods show similar patterns at smaller scales. Neolithic enclosures in Europe were often used intermittently. Ditches were dug, filled, and redug. Timber structures decayed and were replaced. Some enclosures were abandoned for centuries and later revisited. The cycles are visible in soil profiles. The sites do not represent singular founding events. Stone circles in Britain show phased construction. At Stonehenge, the monument evolved over more than a millennium. Elements were added, removed, and rearranged. The earliest earthwork predates the stone settings. Later phases altered orientation and access. The site's significance persisted through changing forms. The record shows renewal rather than origin. In China, long sequences at sites along the Yellow River reveal cycles of settlement and reorganization. Neolithic villages expanded, contracted, and reformed. Early Bronze Age centers rose on or near earlier settlements. Flooding episodes disrupted occupation. Later rebuilding followed. The pattern repeats across regions. These cycles are not always linked to collapse. Some involve planned renewal, others follow environmental change. The archaeological record does not label intent. It preserves order. Layers end. New layers begin. The repetition suggests resilience rather than fragility. Technological cycles also appear. Ceramic styles emerge, standardize, and diversify. Metallurgical practices intensify and later simplify. Toolkits adapt to changing conditions. In some cases, techniques disappear and later reappear. The record shows reuse of ideas rather than constant innovation. Ritual practices exhibit cyclical expression. Burial traditions change form while maintaining underlying principles. Collective burial gives way to individual interment and later returns. Monumental tombs appear and disappear. The cycles vary by region. They recur over long spans. Population density fluctuates. Periods of aggregation are followed by dispersal. Archaeological site counts rise and fall. These changes are often interpreted as growth and collapse. The layers themselves show continuity of presence across transformations. Cycles are easier to detect in long sequences. Where occupation spans centuries, repetition becomes visible. Where sequences are short, beginnings appear singular. This difference reflects duration of record rather than fundamental difference in behavior. The concept of a single beginning assumes a threshold beyond which complexity persists. The archaeological record does not consistently support this. Instead, it shows repeated attainment of similar organizational states, followed by reconfiguration. In some regions, early complexity exceeds later forms. At Göbekli Tepe, monumental construction appears early and then ceases. Later Neolithic settlements are smaller in scale. The cycle reverses expected progression. The record does not explain why. Cycles also appear in land use. Terracing, irrigation, and field systems are constructed, abandoned, and reused. Later populations often repurpose earlier features. The landscape accumulates interventions. Each phase draws on what remains. The visibility of cycles depends on preservation. Erosion can remove evidence of renewal. Submergence can erase entire phases. Where cycles are incomplete, sequences appear linear. Where layers remain, repetition is clear. Archaeological interpretation increasingly recognizes this pattern. Rather than identifying firsts, it traces recurrences. The emphasis shifts from origin to process. The record supports this approach through stratified repetition. Civilization, as represented materially, does not emerge once and persist unchanged. It appears in varied forms at different times. It reorganizes, it contracts, it reappears. The layers record this without narrative framing. The absence of a single beginning does not imply randomness. It reflects adaptive systems responding to conditions. The archaeological record documents outcomes. It does not assign intent. Layers accumulate through repeated use of place. Each generation builds on or beside what remains. Over time, these actions create visible cycles. The soil records them faithfully where preservation allows. The idea of a singular starting point simplifies a complex record. The stratigraphy resists simplification. It shows recurrence rather than inception. The material archive preserves this pattern globally. What appears instead is rhythm. Construction, abandonment, reuse, expansion, contraction, reorganization. These rhythms repeat across regions and periods. They do not align to a single moment. Layers suggest cycles rather than a single beginning. The archaeological record supports this observation consistently. It presents repetition as structure. Interpretation proceeds within that structure. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more documentaries like this. New videos are uploaded regularly. You can also leave a like or a comment if you found it interesting. It helps more than you might think.